My son looked me straight in the eyes and chose his wealthy father-in-law over me. Right in front of a whole room filled with crystal chandeliers and expensive suits. My Ethan said the words I never thought I would hear. He told me, Richard has done more for his future than anyone else. Anyone else? Not his own mother. Not the woman who raised him alone after his father died. The room fell silent as I stood there, trying to hold back my tears. Then the doors opened, and a gray-haired attorney walked inside, carrying a leather briefcase. What happened next would change every life in that room forever. If my story touches your heart, I would love for you to stay with me until the end. And before we continue, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Moments like these remind us we are never truly alone in our struggles. I would also love to hear your thoughts. What would you do if your own child chose money over family? Leave a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. I always enjoy reading every single message. People often assume that the deepest heartbreak comes from losing a spouse. I used to believe that too. Then I watched my own son slowly become a stranger. My name is Brenda Matthews, and at 68 years old, I never imagined I would be telling this story. For most of my life, I was just an ordinary woman. I was no celebrity. I was not wealthy or powerful. I was simply a mother, and for many years, that was more than enough. When my husband Thomas died, Ethan was only 10 years old. I still remember the day I had to break the news. That memory has never left me. The hospital room smelled of disinfectant and fear. Thomas had been fighting an aggressive illness for nearly a year. We both tried so hard to shield Ethan from the worst of it. The children always know more than we think. When the doctor finally walked out and shook his head, my entire world collapsed beneath my feet. I sat beside Thomas's bed, holding his cold hand long after the machines had gone silent. Then, I went home to face the hardest conversation of my life. Ethan was sitting on the living room floor, building something with his old toy cars. He looked up and smiled. Did Dad say when he is coming home? I can still hear those words even now, more than 25 years later. I sat beside him and wrapped my arms around his shoulders. When I told him his father was gone, he stared at me for several long seconds without speaking. Then, he completely broke down. I had never seen such raw pain in a child. That night, he cried himself to sleep in my bed. I stayed awake until sunrise, terrified of what lay ahead, terrified of raising a little boy alone, terrified of failing him, terrified of not being enough. But life does not wait for us to heal. The bills kept coming. The mortgage still needed paying. The groceries still had to be bought. And Ethan still needed his mother. So I got up and kept moving. For years, I worked every single job I could find. In the mornings, I worked as a receptionist at a medical clinic. In the evenings, I waited tables at a local diner. On weekends, I did bookkeeping for a small business owner in town. There were weeks when I barely slept, surviving only on coffee and sheer determination. I remember standing in grocery store aisles with a calculator, carefully adding up every item before putting it in my cart. I remember skipping meals just so Ethan could have the food he liked. I wore the same winter coat for nearly 10 years because replacing it just was not in our budget. But I never regretted it, not once. Every single sacrifice felt worthwhile when I looked at my son. Ethan was a good kid, a truly sweet boy. He was kind, respectful, and hardworking. Whenever I came home exhausted, he would jump in to help without being asked. He washed dishes, folded laundry, and mowed neighbors' lawns to earn extra money. And every Mother's Day, he would make me a beautiful card by hand. I still have every single one of them. The special one, sitting in my bedside drawer, was written when he was only 12 years old. The handwriting is crooked and uneven, but at the bottom he wrote, "Mom, you are the strongest person I know." For years, whenever life got too hard, I would read those words. They reminded me why I kept pushing forward. As he grew older, Ethan became even more determined. He excelled in school. His teachers loved him. His classmates respected him. And by graduation, he had earned a full scholarship to a prestigious university. I was so proud that day, I could barely hold back my tears. I remember sitting in the crowd during his graduation. When they called his name, I stood up and clapped until my hands ached. The woman sitting beside me chuckled and said, "I think everyone knows that is your son." I just smiled and whispered, "That is because he is my greatest achievement." And I truly meant it. Nothing I had ever done mattered more than raising Ethan. Not my career, not my savings, nothing else. Just him. After graduation, life finally seemed to turn around. Ethan left for college, I kept working, and the financial pressure eased slightly. For the first time in years, I actually allowed myself to imagine a future. My friends kept encouraging me to start dating again. Some even tried setting me up with nice men they knew, but I always declined. Not because I was unhappy, but because my priorities had always been crystal clear. My sole focus was Ethan. Looking back now, maybe that was my biggest mistake. Maybe I spent so much time building my son's future that I forgot to build my own. But at the time, it felt like the only choice. Every phone call from Ethan made me smile, and every visit home filled the house with laughter. Back then, he called me his best friend. He asked for my advice about classes, about internships, about life. We talked about absolutely everything, or at least we used to. The first real shift happened during his junior year. It was subtle, so quiet I almost missed it. Our weekly phone calls just started getting shorter. Our talks felt different. Suddenly, he was always bringing up networking, status, and opportunities. Those words never mattered to him before, but now they did. At first, I figured it was normal. College changes kids. Growing up does that. I brushed it off. But then one night he called and brought up a girl named Olivia. Just hearing him talk about her made me smile. I could hear the excitement, the hope, the pure possibility. I sat in my kitchen, smiling as he described her. "Mom, she is smart, really smart." "That is wonderful," I replied. "And her family owns several businesses," he added. He said it so quickly. At the time, it felt meaningless. Now I know better. Over the next few months, her name slipped into every conversation. Ethan sounded happy, and that was all that mattered. If she made him happy, I wanted to welcome her into our lives. I had no clue that meeting her meant letting in the very people who would drive a massive wedge between my son and me. I had absolutely no idea that a man named Richard Whitmore was about to change everything. And I definitely did not know that buried deep beneath decades of silence was a secret about my late husband, Thomas. A secret powerful enough to ruin us all. A secret that would force my boy to choose between cold wealth and family. And when the time came, his choice would completely break my heart. But all of that was still waiting in the shadows. Back then, I was just a proud mom, eager to meet the woman my son loved. I truly believed our hardest years were over. I could not have been more wrong. The second I met Olivia Whitmore, I saw exactly why Ethan fell for her. She was stunning, brilliant, and carried herself so well. She was the kind of person who could walk into any room and command instant attention. With her long blonde hair, bright smile, and effortless poise, she seemed mature beyond her years. When Ethan brought her over for dinner, she showed up with a warm, homemade apple pie. That sweet, simple gesture completely won me over. "I did not know what you liked," she told me, smiling nervously. "So I baked my grandmother's special recipe." I laughed. "Well, then you are already family." It was a beautiful evening. We sat around my tiny dining table for nearly 3 hours, talking about college, future plans, books, and travel dreams. It all felt so effortless and cozy. When it was time to go, I hugged her goodbye. Once she left, I whispered to my son, "She is a keeper." Ethan grinned like a proud kid. That is exactly what I think. For a moment, life was perfect. Their bond grew deeper. Olivia came over often, and she would even call me just to catch up. I truly liked her. More than that, she seemed to genuinely love my son, or at least that is what I believed. A few months later, Ethan asked the question that shifted our lives. "Mom, would you like to meet her parents?" I smiled and said, "Of course." His excitement should have filled me with joy. Instead, for some reason, I felt incredibly anxious. Maybe it was a mother's intuition, or something else. I just could not shake it. 2 weeks later, I met Richard Whitmore. From our very first handshake, I knew he despised me. We met at an elite country club just outside of Columbus, the kind of place where initiation fees cost more than my first car did. I remember feeling completely out of place the second I walked in. The lobby had gleaming marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and art worth more than my home. Everything practically screamed high class and extreme wealth. When Ethan introduced us, Richard offered a hand. Honestly, his fingers barely brushed against mine. His smile was completely empty. "Brenda," he said, not "nice to meet you," just Brenda, as if my name alone did not deserve an ounce of respect. His wife Margaret seemed friendlier, or at least she put on a better show. She smiled, complimented my dress, and asked polite questions. But it felt entirely rehearsed, completely artificial. Every word felt measured. The whole night was off. Whenever I tried talking, Richard looked right through me. But when Ethan spoke, Richard listened intently, especially when the subject turned to business. I soon learned Richard owned several major companies in Ohio, from commercial real estate to investment firms. His fortune was massive, and he loved making sure everyone knew it. Somehow, every single story came back to his success. Every discussion focused on money, influence, or power. At one point, he gestured to a photo on the wall. It was a picture of him with the governor. "I have spent years building relationships with powerful people," he boasted. Then he looked straight at Ethan. "Success is not just about talent. It is about knowing the right people. Ethan nodded with real admiration. I saw it immediately, and it made my stomach churn. My son was always ambitious, but wealth had never impressed him. Never. Yet sitting at that table, I watched something change. Something quiet. Something dangerous. I saw Richard make money seem like the ultimate measure of worth, and my Ethan was hanging on to every word. Over the next year, the Whitmore family slowly took over my son's life. Meanwhile, Olivia graduated. My son graduated too, and they got engaged shortly after. I was thrilled, but noticed him spending more and more time with Richard. Golf outings, business dinners, networking events, and private meetings. Richard treated my son like an investment, a project he could mold into exactly what he wanted, and Ethan seemed eager for the attention. One afternoon, I invited my son to lunch. We met at a small diner we had visited for years, the same place where I used to take him after Little League games, the spot where we had celebrated scholarships and birthdays. Sitting in our usual booth, I noticed he spent most of the meal checking his phone, which he never used to do. Finally, I voiced the nagging question that had been bothering me. "Are you happy?" He looked surprised. "Of course." "You seem different lately," I said. He laughed. "Mom, people grow." "I know," he said. "You don't have to worry about me." The words sounded harmless, but there was a cold distance behind them, a wall. For the first time in my life, I felt like I couldn't fully reach my son. The wedding planning moved quickly. The Whitmores insisted on paying for everything: the venue, the catering, the decorations, absolutely everything. I offered to help, but Richard refused immediately. "That's unnecessary," he said. His tone felt less like kindness and more like dismissal, as if he couldn't imagine I had anything meaningful to offer. I tried to ignore it for my son's sake, but warning signs kept popping up. Little things, tiny moments that didn't seem all that important at first. One evening during a family gathering, I overheard Richard speaking to several guests. They were discussing my son. "He has potential," Richard said. "Potential?" someone asked. "Absolutely. The boy just needed the right environment." The boy? Not Ethan. Not his future son-in-law. Just the boy. Then someone asked a question. "What about his family?" Richard chuckled softly. "I suppose every success story starts somewhere." They laughed quietly and politely, but they laughed. I stood frozen in the hallway. For a second, I considered walking away, but instead, I listened. A guest asked where my husband had worked. Richard cut in before anyone else could. I don't remember exactly. A strange look crossed his face. Only for a split second, but I noticed. Something flickered behind his eyes. It was recognition, not uncertainty, pure recognition. The reaction was so brief that I almost thought I imagined it. Almost. But driving home later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Richard knew something. I didn't know what, but I was sure of it. When my husband's name came up, Richard's face changed completely. The next morning, I pulled out an old photo album. Page after page held memories of another life. Family vacations, school events, birthdays and anniversaries. Then I found a photo of my husband standing with 2 other men at a business event nearly 30 years ago. I stared at the image, my heart slowly starting to race. One of those men looked familiar, older now, heavier now, but unmistakable. It was Richard Whitmore. I sat there staring at the photo for a long time, confused, My husband had never mentioned knowing Richard, not once in all our years together. And yet, there they were, standing side by side, smiling like they knew each other well. The discovery raised more questions than answers. Why did Richard pretend not to know my husband, acting like a complete stranger when we first met? And most importantly, what exactly was he hiding? I had no idea those questions would eventually unravel everything we knew. I still believed the biggest challenge ahead of us was simply adjusting to my son's new life. I didn't yet realize that the past was quietly preparing to return, and when it did, it would expose secrets that had been buried for decades. Secrets connected to my husband, secrets connected to Richard, and secrets that would eventually force my son to make a choice that would break my heart. A few months after finding that old photo of my husband and Richard together, I received an invitation from the Whitmores. It was for a family dinner at their estate, not their house, their estate. That was the word printed on the elegant card. The Whitmores clearly loved reminding everyone just how wealthy they were. By then, my son and Olivia had already set a wedding date, and their engagement became the center of our lives. Every talk revolved around venues, guest lists, and floral arrangements. I tried my best to be supportive, I truly did, but something felt different now. The closer my son grew to them, the farther he seemed from me. I kept telling myself I was imagining it, that I was just struggling with the natural changes of a child becoming an adult. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. The evening of the dinner arrived on a cool autumn Saturday. I drove nearly 40 minutes to reach the Whitmore estate. The moment the gates opened, I felt as if I had entered another world. The driveway stretched through acres of perfectly manicured land. Fountains sparkled under carefully placed lights, and luxury vehicles lined the circular entrance. The house looked more like a private resort than a family home. Parking my cheap sedan among those luxury cars, I suddenly felt completely out of place. I hated feeling like that. I had spent my whole life trying to teach Ethan that money doesn't define your worth. But standing there, I already felt judged before even stepping inside. A valet opened my door, welcoming me. I thanked him quietly and walked toward the massive entrance. Inside, everything was dazzling. Gleaming marble, crystal chandeliers, and artwork that probably cost more than my yearly salary. The rooms were packed with corporate executives, local politicians, and wealthy investors. They were all people who seemed to know Richard Whitmore, and they all seemed incredibly impressed by him. Then I spotted Ethan, and my heart instantly softened. No matter how much things had changed, he was still my little boy. He was still the child who used to run into my arms after school. He smiled the moment he saw me. "Mom, you made it." I hugged him tight. Of course I did. For a second, things felt normal. Then Richard showed up. Brenda. I cringed at that tone. Polite on the surface, dismissive underneath. "Richard," I nodded. "Glad you could join us," he said, sounding more obligated than genuinely welcoming. Before I could even answer, he looked away. Some wealthy donor had just walked into the room. Clearly, that guest was far more important. As the night went on, people mingled while servers carried around expensive appetizers. Conversations centered on investments and business. I tried to jump in whenever I could. Most guests barely even acknowledged me. Some smiled politely, but others lost interest the second they realized I did not belong to their world. I wasn't surprised. What hurt was watching Ethan slowly adapt to that environment. He laughed at jokes he once would have ignored, and nodded eagerly to advice from rich men. He was desperate to prove he belonged. As dinner was announced, everyone moved toward an enormous dining hall. The dining table stretched nearly the whole room, meant for at least 20 guests. Place cards had been laid out with extreme care. Searching for my name, I finally found it near the very end of the table, practically as far from Ethan and Olivia as possible. I figured it was a mistake at first. Then I saw Richard at the center, with Ethan and Olivia sitting right next to him. The VIPs got the prime center seats. The less important guests were pushed to the edges, and I was shoved near the very end. The message was loud and clear. I quietly took my seat, telling myself not to overreact. Surely there was a logical explanation, and I was just being overly sensitive. But then dinner started. Within 15 minutes, Richard crushed any doubts. The dinner table talk turned toward education. A guest bragged about his son getting into an elite business school, while another boasted about their daughter in law school. Eventually, someone asked Ethan about his childhood. Before he could even answer, Richard jumped in. "Ethan's success is remarkable," Richard announced to nodding guests. He smiled, considering how modest his beginnings actually were. The table laughed softly as my stomach knotted. Modest beginnings. What a nice way to phrase years of brutal struggle, years of deep sacrifice, working myself to complete exhaustion just so Ethan could have a real future. I looked over at my son. Surely he would speak up. Surely he would defend me. He stayed silent. Instead, he just laughed awkwardly and changed the subject. That cut deeper than Richard's actual insult. So much more. As the night dragged on, the passive-aggressive insults just kept piling up. Richard spoke of business success, separating winners from ordinary folks, while Margaret boasted about their exclusive social circles. Several guests chatted about vacation homes and private clubs. Every topic seemed designed to remind everyone that I was at the bottom. A woman opposite me asked what I did before retiring. I told her I worked multiple jobs raising my son. She smiled politely. How admirable. But her tone held no real respect, just pure pity. Suddenly, a wave of emotional exhaustion washed over me. Excusing myself, I left the table to get some air. I wandered down a quiet hallway, looking for a restroom. Turning a corner, I caught voices drifting from a nearby study. The door was slightly open. I recognized Richard instantly, and then Ethan. I froze. My gut told me to walk away, but I stood there listening. "I just want things to go smoothly," Ethan said. "It will," Richard answered, assuming unnecessary complications do not arise. A heavy silence followed. Then my son sighed. "My mother means well." Richard chuckled. "That is not always enough." Another pause. Then came the words that shattered everything. The exact words I will never forget. The words that would echo in my head for months afterward. Ethan laughed softly. "Honestly, sometimes she embarrasses me around people like this." I felt like I had been punched right in the chest. The world stopped spinning. I waited for him to take it back, to soften the blow. But he just kept talking. "She just doesn't understand how things work at this level," Richard laughed. And Ethan laughed right along with him. I couldn't even breathe. My son, the boy I had sacrificed absolutely everything for, the child who once called me the strongest person he knew. Now, he was talking about me like some heavy burden, an embarrassment. I slipped away from the door before they could spot me. Tears welled up, but I flat out refused to let them fall. Not there. Not in that house. Not where a man like Richard Whitmore could feed on my pain. I stepped outside and stood frozen under the cold night sky for a few quiet minutes. I just stared into the darkness, trying to steady my breathing, wondering how everything had shattered so fast. Then, another thought hit me. Something Richard said during that conversation about unnecessary complications. That phrase kept gnawing at me. It felt less like a comment about me and more like a warning, as if secrets were moving in the dark, things I was never meant to find out. And for the very first time, I began to suspect that my son wasn't the only one keeping secrets. Richard Whitmore was hiding something too. Something tied to my late husband and to that fading old photograph. Whatever it was deep enough to make him genuinely nervous. I didn't realize it then, but I was standing on the precipice of a truth that would shatter all of our lives. Sleep wouldn't come after that dinner at the Whitmore estate. Every time I closed my eyes, my son's voice echoed back. Sometimes she embarrasses me around people like this. The words replayed endlessly in my mind, like a deep wound that refused to stop bleeding for days. I desperately tried to convince myself it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe I had taken it out of context. Maybe Ethan was just stressed out. Maybe he didn't mean it the way it sounded. As mothers, we are experts at making excuses for our kids, especially when the truth cuts deep. But deep down, I knew exactly what I heard and exactly how much it hurt. The weeks that followed brought zero comfort. If anything, the cold distance growing between my son and me only became more glaring. Our calls got shorter. His visits grew rare. Any time I tried talking about anything real, he deflected toward his job, toward Olivia, toward opportunities, toward his future. Always the future. Never the past, never family, and never us. Out of nowhere, he invited me to lunch. I was stunned. A small part of me hoped he finally wanted to talk about that night at the estate. Maybe he realized how much he was changing. Maybe he wanted us to reconnect. I arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early. It was a sleek downtown steakhouse, way more expensive than the spots we used to share. When Ethan arrived, he looked totally distracted. His phone buzzed constantly. He kept checking his screen throughout the meal. Finally, I couldn't hold back. "Ethan?" He looked up. "Yeah, Mom? I need to ask you something." He immediately looked guarded. "What is it?" I took a breath. "Are you happy?" He frowned. "Why do you keep asking me that?" "Because lately you aren't yourself." His shoulders tensed. "I've changed. Everyone changes." "Then what's the problem?" The sharp frustration in his voice caught me off guard. I stared at him, suddenly seeing a complete stranger across the table. Not the sweet boy I had raised. Not the young man who used to tell me absolutely everything. This was someone else, harder, more guarded. "I just miss you," I whispered. Something briefly flickered in his eyes. Maybe guilt, maybe annoyance, but it vanished in a flash. "I'm busy, Mom." "I get that." "Do you?" His tone sharpened. "I finally have real opportunities." I stayed silent. He leaned back. "Richard has introduced me to people who can make my entire career." There it was again. Richard. Every single conversation circled back to him. Every path somehow led straight to Richard Whitmore. I forced a tight smile. "I'm glad things are going well." "They are." But he didn't sound happy at all. He just sounded defensive. desperately needing reassurance that his choices were right. Our conversation never really recovered after that. When lunch wrapped up, he gave me a brief hug. It felt cold, rushed, nothing like the warm embraces we used to share. I sat there at that table long after he left, agonizing over where my little boy had gone. 2 weeks later, I got my answer, or part of it. The Whitmores threw another gathering. This time, it was small and private, only close family. Olivia invited me herself, and I almost said no. Something told me to stay home, but I loved my son too much to not support him, so I went. The night started out nicely. Dinner was served, the wine flowed, and everyone seemed perfectly relaxed. Then Richard asked my son to step into his study. It sounded casual, but his tone put me on edge. About 20 minutes went by. When neither of them came back, I quietly excused myself and slipped out into the hallway. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, or at least that's what I lied to myself. But near the study door, I heard sharp, angry voices, and then my own name. I froze right there. The door was cracked open. Inside, Richard stood near his desk, while Ethan sat opposite him. A few documents lay between them. "I need to know you are committed," Richard said. "I am completely committed," Ethan replied. Richard crossed his arms. "No distractions." My stomach nodded. And then Richard said the words that would change everything. "If you are joining this family, you must think like family." Ethan nodded. "I do." Richard went on. "And that means understanding priorities." A heavy silence fell. Then came the words I would never be able to forget. "The future we are offering you cannot be limited by obligations that no longer serve a purpose." I felt physically sick as Ethan stared down at the papers. "What exactly are you asking?" Richard sat back slowly. "I am asking if you are truly prepared to put your own future first." Silence stretched. Then Richard spoke clearly, with no hesitation. "Between your mother and this opportunity, which one actually matters more?" The room went dead silent. Even from the hallway, the weight of his question crushed me. My heart was pounding. A part of me already knew the answer, but I still hoped. I still prayed. I believed the boy I raised was still in that room, ready to stand up, ready to defend his mother, ready to say no. Instead, Ethan looked down and shattered my remaining hope. "I am building a future with Olivia." Richard smiled. "Good answer." I closed my eyes. The pain hit me instantly, sharp, heavy, and physical. I wanted to burst into that office. I wanted to scream for an explanation. I wanted to ask how the sweet boy who wept himself to sleep after losing his father became this stranger. But I did not. I just stood there, listening. Richard slid the paperwork across his desk. "Ethan, this is exactly what successful people do. They make hard choices." My son reached for a pen. I could not see the paper, but I watched him sign his name, page after page. Then Richard stood up and offered his hand, and my son shook it. It looked less like family and more like a cold business deal, a bargain that somehow required sacrificing me. I slipped away quietly before they realized I was there. My legs felt like lead and my chest ached. I sat alone on a bench outside the house for several minutes. The freezing night air bit my face, but nothing could numb this pain. Eventually, Ethan came looking for me. "There you are." I forced a weak smile. "Just needed some fresh air, honey. Are you okay?" The question almost made me laugh. No, I was not okay. But I could not face him yet, so I nodded. "I am fine." He looked so relieved, too relieved, as if he was desperate to believe everything was still normal. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I barely remember driving home. I barely even remember walking through my own front door. What I do remember is standing in my living room, staring at a picture of Thomas, the same photo I had looked at hundreds of times over the years. I just stood there for a long time. Then I whispered aloud, "Your son chose them." The words echoed through the empty house. Hearing those words made the truth impossible to deny. Ethan had made his choice, not by accident, not under pressure, not by mistake. He had chosen. The next morning, after a sleepless night, I pulled out an old address book. Most of the numbers were outdated. Some of those people had moved away. Others had passed on. But one crucial name remained: Daniel Coleman. The attorney who worked with Thomas years ago, who still sent me occasional holiday cards. I stared at his number for a long moment, then picked up the phone. When Daniel picked up, I said only one thing. "Daniel, I think it is finally time." A long silence stretched over the line. Then he quietly replied, "I have been wondering when you would call." 3 days later, I met him at his downtown Columbus office. The office had not changed in the 25 years since my last visit. The same brass lobby directory, the same polished wooden staircase, and that quiet atmosphere that made every word feel incredibly heavy. Stepping into the quiet reception area, a wave of anxiety hit me, not because of Daniel, but because of what the past might hold. Some doors stay closed for a very good reason, and I was about to unlock a door sealed for decades. Daniel met me himself. He was in his 70s, his hair completely white. His posture was slightly stooped, but his eyes were still incredibly sharp. When he saw me, his face softened. "Brenda." "Daniel." For a quiet moment, neither of us said a word. Time simply faded away. We were suddenly standing 25 years in the past, back when Thomas was still here, before everything fell apart. Finally, Daniel gestured toward his door. "Come in." I followed him inside to a room smelling of old books and coffee. Legal files lined the shelves, and old photographs covered a wall. Some showed Thomas. Seeing his face caught me completely off guard, Daniel noticed. He was a good man. I smiled sadly. "The best." Daniel nodded. "I agree." We sat down in silence. Then Daniel leaned forward. "Are you sure you are ready?" The question hung in the air. Was I? The truth was, no. I was not ready to uncover Thomas's secrets or find out why Richard Whitmore pretended they were strangers. I wasn't ready to face the fact that my entire past was a lie. But I was ready for the truth, no matter what it cost me. "Yes," I said. Daniel studied my face before standing up and walking toward a locked filing cabinet. He pulled out a thick folder. The edges had yellowed, and dust clung to the corners. It obviously hadn't been opened in years. My heart pounded. Daniel laid the file on his desk and rested his hand on it. "Thomas told me to keep these safe," he murmured. I swallowed hard. "Why?" He believed they would matter one day. The room suddenly felt suffocatingly small. What is in there? Daniel took a slow breath. It is a complicated answer. Then he opened it. Inside lay dozens of contracts, financial statements, letters, and business records. The old paper looked incredibly thin and brittle. I stared down in complete confusion. None of it made sense. Thomas was never a wealthy man, at least not to my knowledge. He worked endless hours to provide for our family, but we never lived extravagantly. Never. Daniel pulled out a single sheet and slid it toward me. Do you recognize this company? I looked down and my eyes widened. The name felt familiar, not from recently, but because I had heard Thomas mention it briefly years ago, back when Ethan was still just a child. I think so, Daniel nodded. Thomas helped start this company. I stared at him. What? He was an original founder. For a few seconds, I couldn't breathe. It made no sense. Absolutely none. If Thomas founded a successful business, why did we struggle so much after he died? Why did I work multiple jobs? Why did he hide this? Daniel saw my confusion. Brenda. What? Thomas sold most of his public shares before he got sick. I frowned. Then why does this matter? Daniel pulled another sheet out. Because he didn't sell everything. Those words hit me like a physical blow. I looked from him to the paperwork and back again. What are you saying? Daniel slid more pages my way. Thomas kept a major stake through a private trust. I stared at the forms, the legal terms blurring. My pulse hammered in my ears. How significant? Daniel hesitated. Extremely. The room fell silent. Outside, traffic kept crawling through the streets of downtown Columbus. Pedestrians walked past. Cars drove by. The world kept spinning, but my own reality was fracturing, slowly and relentlessly. Why didn't he tell me? Daniel's face softened. Because he was dying. I looked away. The sting of that truth never faded, even after all this time. Daniel kept talking. Thomas believed he had time. I closed my eyes. Time. The one thing none of us can control. He meant to explain it all once legal issues were settled. What issues? Daniel hesitated again. His hesitation put me on edge. What are you hiding from me? He looked straight at me. Richard Whitmore. A chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, everything connected. The old photo, the weird reactions, the lies, all of it. What about Richard? Daniel leaned back in his chair. He and Thomas weren't just acquaintances. My stomach tightened. They were business partners. I stared at him, wondering if I had somehow misheard. Partners. Thomas never mentioned that to me. Not once in all our years together. Daniel spoke carefully. They worked together on early projects. Then why did Richard act like they were strangers? Daniel's face darkened. I have been asking myself that for years. The heavy silence that followed felt dangerous. I suddenly realized this wasn't just about cash. It was about something massive, something they wanted buried. Daniel opened another part of the file. Inside were letters, many from Thomas, with several addressed straight to Richard. I picked one up, my fingers shaking. The page discussed stock ownership, investments, and partnership details. The date made me gasp. He wrote it just months before his illness struck. I looked up. If they were partners, what happened? Daniel sighed. After his diagnosis, things changed. How? Richard grew incredibly aggressive. Alarm flared inside me. Daniel added, "There were fights over money, mostly." Partly, his expression hardened. There were bitter fights over control. I felt a tight knot in my stomach. The deeper we dug, the worse it sounded. Did Thomas trust him? Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out a sealed envelope from the folder. It bore my late husband's handwriting. My breath caught. I knew those elegant letters instantly. I had seen them on cards, notes, grocery lists, and love letters. For a split second, it felt like Thomas was right there. Daniel gently took out a page and handed it over. Near the bottom was his familiar signature. A single sentence was heavily underlined. I read it 3 times. My heart stopped. If anything happens to me, do not trust Richard Whitmore. Those impossible words sat there in cold black ink. Written by my husband years before he died, long before Ethan ever met Olivia. Years before the Whites entered our lives, I slowly looked up. Daniel's face revealed everything he'd known all along. All this time, he knew something was terribly wrong. And now, for the very first time, I finally understood why. The room turned cold. The stakes felt massive now because this was no longer just about a son choosing his wealthy father-in-law. No, this was about a secret buried for decades. A secret tied to Thomas. A secret tied to Richard. One so terrifying my dying husband had to leave behind this final warning. Staring at those words, one chilling truth became clear. Richard Whitmore had spent years pretending his dark past never even existed. And people only fight that hard to bury a secret when the truth can completely destroy them. For nearly 2 weeks after meeting with Daniel Coleman, I kept what I'd learned entirely to myself. Not a word to Ethan, Olivia, or my closest friends. I carried this secret like a heavy stone in my chest, waking up every single morning thinking of Thomas's letter. Every night, I reread the copy Daniel gave me. The exact same sentence haunted my mind. If anything happens to me, do not trust Richard Whitmore. I desperately wanted to believe there was some innocent mistake, some massive misunderstanding buried beneath decades of dark secrets. But deep down, I knew better. My husband had never been careless with his words. If he wrote that warning, he had a terrifying reason. Meanwhile, Daniel kept digging. Old files were pulled from the archives. Corporate records were scrutinized. Former business associates tracked down. And the deeper Daniel dug, the more worried he became. He didn't share everything with me right away, but I could easily see it in his eyes. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Then Ethan called. "Mom, I need a favor," he said, his voice sounding forced and way too cheerful. That sudden upbeat tone instantly made me suspicious. What kind of favor? "We'd love for you to attend a charity gala next month." I frowned. A charity gala? Yeah, why me? He just laughed and said, "Because you're family." It felt completely rehearsed, but I still agreed to go. Part of me wanted to support my son. Part of me wanted to watch his in-laws. And honestly, Daniel had just uncovered something very interesting. This gala was run by one of Richard's foundations, the very same one tied to several of the shadow companies Daniel was investigating. I didn't know what it all meant just yet, but I fully intended to find out. It was held at one of the most expensive hotels in Columbus. The grand ballroom looked like a movie set, with massive crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceilings. Musicians played softly near the stage. Hundreds of wealthy elite packed the room, mostly affluent business owners. The rest were politicians and heavy donors. Everywhere I looked, I saw designer gowns and priceless jewelry. I arrived completely alone, immediately spotting Ethan and Olivia playing hosts near the front door. They looked so elegant, so successful, absolutely perfect on the surface. Ethan smiled when he saw me, telling me I looked great. Olivia hugged me warmly, saying she was glad I came. I just smiled, replying that I wouldn't miss it. For one brief second, everything felt almost normal. Then Richard approached, his fake smile flashing instantly. It was that exact look he saved for when high society eyes were on him. Brenda. He used that familiar voice again, warm, controlled, and entirely fake. Richard. He gestured towards several wealthy guests nearby. Before I could even say a word, he was ushering me over to a group of rich donors. At first, the introduction felt harmless. But then, Richard started speaking. This is Brenda Matthews. Everyone smiled politely as Richard continued, introducing me simply as Ethan's mother. More polite smiles. Then came the unnecessary, calculated blow. Brenda spent most of her life in a small town outside Columbus, he said. A few guests gave tight nods. She worked several jobs while raising Ethan, he added. More polite smiles. But I knew exactly what Richard was doing. He wasn't introducing me. He was defining me, shrinking my entire life to a quaint backstory, a mere prop in my son's success. One donor chuckled. Well, you certainly raised a very ambitious son, one guest noted. Richard smiled, replying that, thankfully, Ethan had moved far beyond his humble roots. My stomach tightened. It was a subtle, cruel insult masked as praise, exactly how Richard liked to play. I quickly looked over at my son. He heard it. I know he did. But once again, he kept quiet. That silence cut deeper than the insult. As the night went on, the snubs only got worse. Nothing dramatic or loud, just constant little remarks and subtle dismissals. Tiny reminders that I simply did not belong in their upper-class world. Later, I joined a chat about business management. The second I shared an opinion, an executive smoothly changed the subject, acting as if my voice meant absolutely nothing. Another woman asked where I had gone to school. When I explained that I couldn't afford college, her interest instantly vanished into thin air. Everywhere I turned, I met that same cold attitude. These people measured worth by money, status, and power. Everything except true character. I watched Richard thrive in that crowd. He ruled that ballroom like a king, shaking hands and soaking up the praise. But then, the unexpected happened. I was standing near a display table when a voice behind me called my name. I turned and saw an older man watching me. He was tall, silver-haired, and expensively dressed. For a moment, he just stared. Then his eyes went wide. He whispered, "My God." I frowned, confused. He stepped closer, saying I probably did not remember him. I quietly studied his face. Something about him felt familiar, but I just couldn't place it. Then he smiled and said his name. Victor Reynolds. It hit me instantly. Thomas had mentioned Victor many times over the years. A business partner, a close friend, a trusted colleague. Suddenly, I remembered meeting him briefly, decades ago. Victor, I gasped. His smile grew wider as he said he couldn't believe it was me. We shared a quick hug, but then he looked genuinely shocked, asking what I was doing there. I laughed softly. I told him my son was invited. His face shifted, not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. Then he asked a very strange question. He asked if Richard knew I was here. I frowned, saying, of course he did. Victor stared at me in absolute disbelief. Then his eyes drifted across the ballroom, looking toward Richard, toward Ethan, and toward Olivia. Finally, he looked back at me and whispered 4 words that changed everything. The original owner. I blinked, asking what he meant. He repeated it. The original owner. My pulse quickened as the room suddenly felt smaller, colder, and far more dangerous. I said I didn't understand. He seemed surprised by my confusion, asking if nobody had told me. Told me what? I demanded. His face darkened and he went silent. Then he lowered his voice, telling me we needed to talk. Instantly, every single one of my instincts went on high alert. Before I could speak, a voice interrupted. Victor. Richard Whitmore stood right there. For the first time since I had met Richard, I saw real fear in his eyes. It was only for a split second, but it was there. Victor saw it too, and they just stared at each other, silent and cold. The thick tension between them was unmistakable. Finally, Richard forced a laugh, saying he didn't realize we knew each other. Victor shot back immediately. He said we went back a very long way. Those words carried a heavy weight, the kind of meaning everyone in that room missed, except for Richard. For the first time, I saw a muscle twitch in Richard's jaw. He looked deeply, visibly uncomfortable. Victor looked at me, then back at Richard, and delivered a line that made Richard completely lock up. He muttered that some histories are hard to erase. The silence that followed felt incredibly dangerous. Richard recovered quickly. He always did. But I had already seen enough. Something connected these two. Something connected Thomas. Something connected me. And whatever that dark secret was, Victor clearly held the key. The rest of that evening passed by in a complete blur. I barely heard the speeches or noticed the auction. My mind kept looping back to Victor's chilling words. The original owner. What did that even mean? Owner of what? And why did Richard look so terrified to hear it? Walking out of that ballroom, one thing was painfully clear. Daniel was right. The deeper we dug, the more paranoid Richard got, and nervous people make mistakes. Sooner or later, Richard Whitmore was going to slip up. When he did, the truth he had hidden for decades would finally come to light. I met Victor Reynolds 3 days after the gala. He had insisted on choosing the meeting place, a quiet diner on the edge of town. No reporters, no executives, no prying eyes, just the two of us. That request alone told me how heavy this was. When I walked in, Victor was already there. A cup of cold coffee sat untouched in front of him. He looked nervous. It surprised me, considering Victor had spent decades running in elite corporate circles. Men like him usually radiated confidence, control, and absolute authority. But that morning he seemed fragile, carrying a burden that had weighed on him for decades. As I sat, he wasted no time. He thanked me for coming, but I just needed answers. He nodded, acknowledging my urgency. A heavy silence fell between us. Finally, I asked the question that had haunted my thoughts all week. What did you mean by original owner? Victor leaned back slowly, releasing a heavy breath before admitting the truth was incredibly complicated. So was everything Daniel showed me, I replied. His eyes narrowed. Have you been talking to Daniel? When I nodded, he sighed. That seemed to confirm his fears. He whispered that I was further along than he expected. I quietly folded my hands. Victor, stop dancing around it. His expression softened. Fair enough, he agreed. He reached into a leather folder, pulling out photocopied files. As he slid them across the table, my chest tightened. The name printed on them was the exact same company Daniel had found. The one Thomas helped build decades ago. It was the same company linked to Richard Whitmore. Victor tapped the first page, telling me this was where it all began. Looking down, I saw 4 original founders listed: Thomas Matthews, Victor Reynolds, 2 strangers I didn't recognize, and Richard Whitmore. Seeing their names together sent a cold shiver down my spine. Back then, Victor told me, none of them had any money. They were ambitious, especially Thomas. Victor smiled faintly, calling him brilliant. The praise didn't surprise me. Thomas was always brilliant and visionary, but hearing it from someone else still filled me with pride. Victor added that everyone thinks Richard built his empire alone. His voice turned cold. He didn't. Looking up, I met his gaze as he told me that without Thomas, Richard would be nothing. Those words hit hard. For decades, Richard behaved as if he built every piece of this empire with his own 2 hands. Now, that carefully crafted illusion was fracturing. Victor opened a new folder, revealing old contracts, deeds, and funding documents. I couldn't grasp all the legal jargon, but one thing was undeniably clear. My husband's role was far greater than I ever imagined. So much bigger. Why didn't he tell me? I whispered. Victor paused before replying that Thomas never cared about boasting. A sad smile touched my lips. That was exactly like him. He always put family before fortune. Victor's face fell as he added that Richard believed the exact opposite. Silence stretched between us for a long moment, and then Victor said something that turned my stomach. The trouble started when Thomas fell ill. My mind rushed back to his final year, the grueling hospital visits, the endless treatments, the crushing weight of uncertainty. Victor nodded gently, reading my grief. While my husband fought for his life, Richard fought to steal his legacy. I stared at him, demanding to know what he meant, as he pulled out another document. This paper looked cleaner, more official. After the diagnosis, they changed the company's entire ownership structure. I frowned, asking what he meant by modified. His tense silence spoke volumes before he could even answer. My heart pounded. Victor? I pleaded. He looked up, admitting not all of it was legal. The room felt freezing. What are you telling me? I asked. Victor leaned in, explaining that Richard capitalized heavily on Thomas's failing health. I sank back, completely speechless. For so long, I believed some cruel twist of fate caused all our hardships, just terrible luck and tragedy. But now, a far darker truth was creeping in. Victor watched me, speaking softly. He mentioned Daniel had shared some details, but I only knew fragments. Victor opened another folder to fill the gaps. Inside were letters exchanged between my husband and Richard, filled with escalating anger, bitter suspicion, and outright hostility. The warmth of their early years had completely evaporated. Then, one letter caught my eye, I instantly knew Thomas's hand. My hands trembled as I read his words. They were direct, blunt, and uncharacteristically furious. He accused Richard of breaking promises, hiding financial records, and operating behind his back. I looked up in disbelief. "Thomas wrote this?" I asked. Victor nodded, saying it was penned 6 months before his death. My gentle husband never got angry. For him to write something so bitter, things must have been incredibly grave. Victor folded his hands in silence. "It got ugly at the end," Victor said. When I asked how, he whispered that it was the kind people hide forever. Staring back down at those papers, the puzzle pieces were slowly, painfully, beginning to fall into place. Then he dropped another bombshell, asking if I knew why Richard looked absolutely petrified to see him at the gala. I shook my head, mute. "Because I know where the real ownership files are," he said, his voice hanging in the cold air. "Ownership files." My pulse surged. "What records?" Victor smiled a sad, faint smile. "The very papers Richard hoped were gone forever." My breathing stopped. For decades, Richard had basked in his massive empire, his glittering reputation, his legacy. Now, Victor was telling me the foundation of his entire world was built on a lie. Suddenly, everything made sense. Daniel's frantic warnings, the cryptic notes Thomas left behind, and Richard's sheer panic whenever his past was brought up. The truth threatened to destroy his entire world. Victor opened one last folder, revealing papers that looked far more official and heavily detailed. Sliding them across the table, he whispered they were copies. Looking down, the first sheet detailed company shares. My eyes widened in disbelief. I read the numbers once, twice, 3 times. I had to be reading this wrong. But I wasn't. The cold, hard numbers didn't change. My husband's share of the company was massive, far larger than I dreamed, big enough to rewrite our entire history. It explained why Richard spent decades acting like Thomas never existed, why Daniel hid these files so fiercely, and why Victor had just looked at me and called me the rightful owner. Because if these papers were real, then the vast empire Richard bragged about was never truly his to keep. It belonged to Thomas, and when he was gone, it became mine. I stared at the paperwork, completely numb. How much? Victor let out a slow, heavy breath. A lot. That is not an answer. He nodded. No, it is not. Then he finally said it. Enough that Richard would do absolutely anything to keep this quiet. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of it was paralyzing. My whole life, I believed I was just a widow, struggling to survive after losing my husband. Now I was learning a completely different truth had existed in the shadows. A dark reality, hidden from me, hidden from Ethan, hidden from almost everyone. Victor grew dead serious. "Brenda, there is something else." I slowly looked up. "What?" The second Richard realizes Daniel is reopening these files, he is going to panic. My stomach knotted up. Panic? Victor nodded. People who have spent decades guarding a secret rarely go quietly. His warning felt real, not dramatic, not exaggerated. It was raw. For the first time, I saw what we were actually up against. This was no simple family disagreement. This was not just a fight between a mother and her son. This was a decades-old war over truth, ownership, and deep betrayal. And Richard Whitmore could feel the walls finally closing in on him. Leaving the restaurant that afternoon, one thought haunted me all the way home. For years, Richard had owned the story. He had controlled the narrative, deciding what people believed. But now, the proof was resurfacing. The documents and records were real. The witnesses were still out there. And sooner or later, Richard Whitmore would have to face the music. 1 week after meeting Victor, Ethan showed up at my door unannounced. The second I opened it, I knew something was terribly wrong. My son looked completely drained. Dark shadows hung under his eyes, his shoulders incredibly tense. An intense panic in his eyes put me on guard instantly. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. I stepped aside. "Of course." He walked in, slowly scanning the room. My living room had barely changed over all these years. The same old photos, the same worn furniture, the handmade Mother's Day cards he drew as a little boy. For a fleeting second, I wondered if he even saw them, if he remembered. But whatever nostalgia he felt faded fast. He had not come here to walk down memory lane. He was here for something else. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, wrapped in a heavy silence. Then Ethan finally broke it. "You have been meeting with Daniel Coleman." It was not a question. My stomach knotted up again. So Richard already knew, or at least suspected. I stayed calm. "Yes?" Ethan leaned forward. "Mom, what are you doing?" His sharp frustration stung. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean." I stared at him. The little boy I raised felt a million miles away. "I am just looking into some old things involving your father." His jaw clenched. "That is not what Richard says." There it was. Always Richard. I took a slow, deep breath. "And what exactly does Richard say?" Ethan paused, carefully picking his words. "He says you are trying to stir up trouble that should stay buried." The irony almost made me laugh. Trouble that should stay buried. A telling choice of words, because innocent people do not fear the truth. "I see." Ethan rubbed his face. "Mom, please." That single word sounded completely real, almost desperate. For a second, my heart ached for him. Then I remembered the paperwork, the fake signatures, the cold laughter, and his betrayal. "What do you want from me, Ethan?" He did not hesitate. "Stop." I stared at him. "Stop what?" "Just whatever you are doing." The kitchen fell dead silent. I looked closely at my son, really looked at him. Not the successful businessman, not Olivia's husband, not Richard's little protege. Just my boy. The one I sacrificed everything to raise. And right then, a painful realization hit me. He was not here because he cared about me. He was here to save himself, protecting his reputation, his comfortable lifestyle, and his future. I asked him softly, "Are you afraid?" His eyes widened. "No." I stayed silent, waiting. He looked away first, and that was answer enough. "Ethan." He looked back at me. "Why are you really here?" The heavy silence stretched out until he finally spoke. "Richard says this will hurt a lot of people." I slowly nodded. Maybe some things are better left alone. I could barely believe his words. Better left alone. Yes. I leaned back in my chair. So, because someone was hurt, We should just ignore it? That is not what I mean. It sounds exactly like what you mean. His frustration boiled over. Mom, you are making this so much harder. Those words cut deeper than he could ever comprehend. For decades, I had done the exact opposite. I spent my life making everything easy for him. I worked double shifts, skipped holidays, walked away from opportunities, sacrificing my comfort, my sleep, and my dreams, just to give him a better life. And now, he wanted me to sacrifice the truth, all for Richard, for wealth and convenience. I folded my hands. Tell me something honestly. He nodded cautiously. What? If your father were sitting here with us right now, what would he tell us to do? My question completely froze him. His eyes dropped to the table. For a split second, he looked almost ashamed. Then it passed. That is not fair, he said. Why not? Because Dad is not here. No, he is not. The heavy ache of that truth hung between us. Then Ethan caught me off guard. Richard gave me opportunities Dad never could. Those words hit like a physical blow. I just stared at him, completely unable to process what he had said. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping hard against the wood. Ethan instantly saw that he had gone too far. Mom, I did not mean... Yes, you did. His face went pale. You meant every single word. Total silence fell over the room. I walked to the window, watching leaves drift across the grass. The very same yard where Ethan used to play baseball. The yard where Thomas taught him how to ride his first bike. The yard where we built our entire life together. A life my son seemed desperate to leave behind. Turning back to face him, my voice sounded steady, far steadier than I actually felt. Do you have any idea what your father gave you? Ethan stayed quiet. He gave you his name. Just silence. He gave you his principles. Quiet. He gave you a family. Still nothing. Then I delivered the one truth he needed to hear, and he worked himself to death to build something he believed would protect you. The entire room went dead cold. I saw a flash of pure confusion cross his face, just a brief flicker of doubt. He had no clue what I meant, no clue what Daniel and Victor had actually found. No concept of how tied his future was to the dad he wanted to erase. But I was not about to lay my cards down. Not yet. Ethan stood up, his face hardening. Any hint of softness from moments ago evaporated. Richard's grip took hold again. The shields went up. The cold ambition returned. Mom, he said. I waited. He reached deep into his briefcase and pulled out a document. My heart started racing. What is that? I asked. He laid it on the table. Just a form. I stared. What kind of form? His response sent a chill through me. A legal release. I stepped closer to inspect the page. It looked mostly standard, but one paragraph jumped out. It was all about future claims, liabilities, and legal disputes. I snapped my head up. Who gave you this? He stayed silent. He did not need to speak. We both knew it was Richard. What is this for? Ethan crossed his arms. It protects everyone. I nearly laughed. Protects everyone. Just another rehearsed corporate lie. What does it really mean? His tone hardened. It guarantees you will not pursue claims over old business matters. And there it was, the truth. At last, I saw it. Richard was not just nervous. He was petrified, terrified enough to send my son as his messenger with legal threats. I looked down at the paper, then locked eyes with my son. After a long silence, I had just one question. If I sign this, who actually wins? Ethan stayed quiet. His silence spoke volumes. I stared at my boy, really looked at him, and right then, I decided to offer him one last opportunity. Maybe his only real chance left. I slid the paper back across the wood toward him. I measured my words carefully. Ethan, just listen to me. He waited. If Richard's empire is built on honesty, he has nothing to fear. His face grew tense. If the truth is on his side, he wins. More silence. But if the truth is not on his side, I let the threat linger. For the first time today, doubt flickered in his eyes. I kept going. Think very carefully about the side you are choosing. The room went dead silent. For a second, I hoped my message got through, that he remembered who he was. Instead, he grabbed the paper, slid it back in his bag, and stood. I have already made my choice, he said. It felt like a knife twist, not from shock, but because it confirmed my worst fears. My own son rejected his family, his late father's legacy, and the mother who raised him. He chose Richard Whitmore instead. Watching Ethan walk to the door, a wave of deep grief washed over me. Yet, strangely, I also felt completely clear. The waiting was finally over. No more doubts. The path was set, and now he would have to face the consequences. Once the door clicked shut, I stood frozen in the quiet kitchen. Within minutes, my phone started buzzing. Daniel was calling. I picked up on the first ring. He sounded incredibly tense. Brenda, what happened? He paused for a heartbeat, then said the exact words that changed our lives forever. I think we are ready. 3 weeks after my son walked out, Richard hosted what he dared to call a family celebration. On paper, the gala was to announce a massive corporate expansion. Behind closed doors, everyone knew the night belonged to Ethan. Richard wanted to unveil him to the world as the future leader of his entire business empire. The golden boy, the ruthless young executive handpicked to carry the family legacy to the next generation. High-profile investors, executives, donors, and journalists all received invitations. This was never going to be just a quiet family dinner. It was a full-blown coronation, and Richard wanted to bask in the spotlight. He booked the grand ballroom of that luxury hotel, the exact same place as our last gala. That choice was entirely deliberate. Richard loved playing to a crowd. He thrived on complete control over his story. What he did not realize was that his entire world was about to change. 3 days before the event, Daniel met me at his office one last time. When I got there, every document was organized, labeled, and ready. Daniel looked exhausted, but satisfied, like a man who had finally finished a puzzle decades in the making. Everything is confirmed, he told me. I sat down slowly and asked him what we had. Daniel opened a massive binder. The evidence seemed endless. Original agreements, partnership records, private letters, corporate restructuring documents, witness statements, letters from Thomas and Richard, and most importantly, legal records showing the transfer of ownership rights after Thomas passed away. My head spun as Daniel explained it all. For years, Richard had played the sole architect of his success, the visionary, the founder, the great empire builder. The truth was far different. The original company was built by several people, but Thomas Matthews had held one of the largest ownership positions. And before he died, he took steps to protect those interests. Steps Richard apparently believed had vanished forever. They had not. Daniel leaned forward. "Brenda, once this is public, there is no going back." I nodded. I told him I understood. He asked if I was sure. The question deserved serious thought. I thought about my son Ethan, the little boy who held my hand crossing the street, the teenager who once called me his hero, the young man who now chose status over his own family. I still loved him. That would never change. But love and silence are different things, and shielding someone from the consequences of their choices is not always a kindness. Sometimes it is just weakness. I looked directly at Daniel and said, "Yes." He nodded and closed the binder. "Then let's finish this." The night of the gala arrived sooner than I expected. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror for several minutes before leaving. Not because I feared Richard or what might happen, but because I was thinking of Thomas. I picked up the photograph on my dresser, the very same picture I had looked at countless times over the years. His smile remained unchanged, warm, kind, and steady. "I hope I am doing the right thing," I whispered. Then I set it down and left. When I reached the hotel, the ballroom was already crowded. Hundreds of guests packed the space. The room buzzed with excitement. Servers carried champagne, photographers snapped pictures, and business leaders exchanged handshakes. Everyone seemed eager to celebrate Richard Whitmore's latest triumph. Nobody knew they were about to witness his downfall. I spotted my son Ethan almost immediately, standing with Olivia near the stage. Both looked elegant, confident, and successful. But when Ethan saw me walk in, his expression shifted. The confidence vanished for a second, replaced by concern. He walked toward me. "Mom." I smiled politely and said his name. His eyes searched my face, trying to see if I knew something. Perhaps he already suspected. "Thanks for coming," he said. "I was invited," I replied. The conversation felt incredibly strained, nothing like the talks we used to share. Before either of us could say another word, Olivia approached. To her credit, she seemed genuinely pleased to see me, giving me a warm hug. For a brief second, I felt sorry for her. Unlike Ethan, she had absolutely no idea what was happening. She still believed her father was an honorable man. She believed the lies Richard had spent years feeding to everyone. Soon, that illusion would shatter. The lights dimmed. Guests began taking their seats as the presentation started. I noticed Daniel slip in through a side door. He did not look like an attorney preparing for battle. Calm, professional, and ordinary, he blended in perfectly, which made him even more dangerous. Richard stepped onto the stage first. The applause was immediate, loud, and enthusiastic. Exactly what he expected. Smiling broadly, he thanked everyone and delivered a highly polished speech about leadership, vision, and success. Then he turned toward Ethan, saying his family had always believed in investing in the future. Amidst more applause and smiles, Richard extended his arm toward my son. And tonight, I am proud to introduce our next generation of leadership. Ethan stood up as the crowd cheered. Photographers raised their cameras. Richard looked absolutely delighted, victorious, and certain. Then everything shattered. A voice rang out from the back. "Before you continue, Mr. Whitmore, there are several matters requiring immediate clarification." The room went dead silent. Every single head turned. Daniel stood calmly near the entrance with his briefcase. For a few long seconds, nobody moved. Richard's smile vanished completely. The transformation was striking. For the first time since I had met him, he looked genuinely frightened. Not annoyed, terrified. Ethan stared at Daniel in confusion. Olivia looked just as lost. Guests started whispering among themselves. Richard recovered first, asking what this was. His voice sounded tight, controlled, dangerously so. Daniel walked forward, slow and deliberate. Every single step ratcheted up the tension in the room, until he finally stopped near the front. "I'm Daniel Coleman." Silence. "I represent the estate interests of Thomas Matthews." His name echoed through the crowded ballroom. Thomas Matthews, my husband. Spoken aloud, publicly, for the first time in years. I watched Richard's face closely as the color completely drained from it. Daniel continued, "And I also represent Brenda Matthews." Every eye in the room swung toward me. I felt exposed, but I sat there completely still. Daniel unzipped his briefcase and pulled out several folders. The very files we spent weeks prepping. The proof Richard spent decades trying to bury. "What are you doing?" Richard spat. Daniel ignored him, turning his attention to the crowd instead. For years, crucial facts about ownership and business succession have been kept hidden. The entire room went dead silent. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. We all knew something massive was unfolding. Then, Daniel held up a single document. "This record proves the original ownership structure from the company's founding." He paused, then dropped the bomb that changed everything. "Contrary to what you've been told, Mr. Whitmore was never the sole founding owner." A collective gasp swept the room. Richard's face hardened. Ethan looked completely stunned. Olivia stared at her father, completely lost and terrified. Daniel didn't stop. "The largest surviving stake in this company does not belong to Richard Whitmore." He turned, looking straight at me, before delivering the final blow. "It belongs to Brenda Matthews." Silence. Total, heavy silence. For a few endless seconds, nobody breathed. Not Richard, not Ethan, not the investors or reporters. Absolutely no one. Because in one single moment, the empire Richard spent decades building started to crumble to the ground. And this was just the beginning. The silence in that room was suffocating. Hundreds of wealthy people sat completely frozen. Nobody moved. Even the press seemed too shocked to snap a single photo. But I just sat there. My hands were folded calmly in my lap. After all the pain, I expected to feel victorious and vindicated. Instead, a deep sadness washed over me, because across the room sat my son, wearing a look I had never seen before. Shock. Total shock. He stared at me as if he were looking at a complete stranger for the first time, as if the mother he thought he knew had suddenly become a total stranger. Near the front, Daniel remained standing, completely composed and professional. Richard, however, looked like a man watching his entire life turn to ash. His face was stark pale, that smug, confident smile he always wore had completely vanished. For the first time in decades, Richard didn't control this room. The truth did. Finally, he managed to speak. "This is ridiculous," he spat, his voice sharper than he intended. Daniel calmly opened another folder. "Is it?" Richard pointed at the paperwork. "Those records are incomplete." Daniel didn't even flinch. "Incomplete?" "Yes." Richard adjusted his jacket, trying to summon back his old confidence, or at least fake it. "There were numerous restructuring agreements," Richard argued. Daniel nodded. "Correct. And you claimed they superseded the original terms?" Daniel's face didn't change. "No, they did not." A quiet murmur rippled through the investors' anxious huddle. Board members whispered frantically. Several reporters started scribbling down notes. Richard's jaw clenched tight. Then Daniel pulled out another paper, one I recognized instantly. My late husband's signature was clearly written at the bottom. This agreement specifically protected the Matthews family's stake. The room fell deeper into silence. Daniel pressed on. "Legally executed." He showed another paper. "Legally witnessed. Legally recorded." Then one last sheet. "And legally enforceable." Each word hit Richard like a physical blow. I watched him crumble, piece by piece, as his defenses shattered. Still, he refused to surrender. "What are you implying?" Richard demanded. Daniel looked directly at him, pausing for effect. "I am stating facts." The entire room held its breath, waiting for Daniel's next blow. For years, Thomas Matthews' ownership was protected inside private estate structures. He glanced my way. Those assets transferred directly to Brenda Matthews upon his passing. Gasps rippled through the hall, and everyone turned to stare. I suddenly realized what they were thinking. For years, they saw me as a small-town widow who didn't belong in their elite world, a woman Richard openly looked down upon. Now they knew the truth. The empire they worshipped was built on the backs of the very family Richard had cast aside. The irony was almost unbearable. Finally, Ethan stood up. "Mom," he choked out, his voice thick with confusion, regret, and fear. I looked at him in silence, seeing his desperation. But Daniel wasn't finished, and neither was the truth. He opened another folder, revealing letters written between Thomas and Richard. I watched guests lean forward. Even Richard looked uneasy. Daniel held up a letter written 6 months before my husband Thomas passed away. He began reading selected passages. Not every word, but just enough to establish a clear pattern of conflict, a pattern of distrust, showing how my husband had grown deeply concerned about Richard's actions. Each excerpt made Richard look worse, exposing another crack in the image he spent years building. Finally, Daniel stopped. He looked directly at the audience. "What you are seeing tonight is not a misunderstanding." Silence. "It is not confusion." More silence. "And it is not ancient history." The room stayed completely still before his next words hit. "It is evidence." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Olivia stood slowly. Her eyes locked onto her father. "Dad," she whispered. Richard looked toward her, seeming genuinely uncertain for the first time tonight. "Dad, is any of this true?" Her question cut deeper than anything Daniel said. It came from his daughter, not an attorney or a rival. His own daughter. Richard hesitated only briefly, but everyone noticed. In situations like this, hesitation is more damaging than an answer. Olivia's expression shattered immediately. She saw the hesitation in the cracks. "Dad," she pleaded. Richard finally spoke. "Things are more complicated than they make them sound." A weak defense. Too weak. Even he seemed to realize it. Olivia stepped back, the utter disappointment on her face breaking my heart. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She was just another victim of Richard's lies. Then, Daniel delivered the revelation that changed everything. He pulled one final document from the folder, the very paper I had reviewed during our prep meetings. I knew it would have a devastating effect. This was a letter written by my late husband, Thomas. Richard immediately stiffened. Daniel explained that it had been stored privately for decades. The room went silent again. Then Daniel read it aloud. "If anything happens to me, do not trust Richard Whitmore." The impact was instant. Audible gasps filled the ballroom as people turned toward Richard in sheer disbelief. The words were simple but devastating because they came from my husband, who once trusted Richard enough to build a business with him. A man who knew him better than anyone. Richard's face flushed red, yelling that it proved nothing. Daniel calmly folded the letter. "Perhaps not by itself," Daniel replied, opening another folder. "That is why we did not come with only one document." The crowd waited, breathless. Daniel outlined corporate decisions made during my husband's illness, transactions and ownership changes that benefited Richard and raised serious questions. Nothing was presented dramatically. Nothing was exaggerated. Cold facts spoke louder than emotion, and they were devastating. When Daniel finished, the room felt completely different. Richard was no longer the respected visionary commanding the center of the ballroom. He was a man drowned in doubt. His story no longer made sense, and his carefully built reputation was completely unraveling. Then something unexpected happened. Daniel closed his final folder and stepped back. The room remained absolutely silent. Everyone waited for more. Instead, Daniel looked directly at me and gave a small, meaningful nod. I stood up slowly, every eye in the ballroom following me. I was never used to being the center of attention. I never had been. Most of my life was spent working, living, and loving quietly. But tonight was not about attention. It was about the truth. Looking around the room, I spoke. My husband never cared about being the richest man in the room. Silence. He cared about integrity. More silence. He believed success meant treating people with dignity. I glanced toward Ethan. The pain in his eyes nearly broke me, but I continued. For years, I stayed silent because I truly believed it protected my family. The room hung on every word. I now understand that silence can also protect wrongdoing. Nobody moved or interrupted. I finally shared the truth I carried for weeks. I did not pursue this for revenge. Looking straight at Richard, I added, I pursued it because the truth matters. For the first time, Richard could not look me in the eye. That told everyone everything. As I sat back down, absolute silence filled the room. Investors looked worried. Reporters looked energized. Board members looked frightened, while Olivia looked completely devastated. And my son, Ethan, looked shattered. For the first time, he was beginning to realize what he had chosen and exactly who he had chosen against. The days after that confrontation felt completely surreal. For nearly 30 years, Richard Whitmore had controlled our story. Then, in a single evening, his narrative completely fell apart. Cracks appeared almost instantly. By the next morning, local business papers were already reporting on our revelations. Reporters chased me for interviews. Board members demanded emergency meetings. Investors started asking uncomfortable questions. For the first time in decades, Richard Whitmore no longer dictated the narrative. The truth did. I watched everything play out from a distance, not out of apathy, but because I was just so tired, emotionally drained. The past few weeks had consumed so much of me. I wanted peace, but peace was impossible. Not yet. The fallout was just beginning. 3 days after the chaos, Daniel called. His voice carried a level of satisfaction I had rarely heard from him. "Things are moving quickly." I sat at my kitchen table. "How quickly?" Daniel laughed softly. "Faster than Richard expected." That did not surprise me. Men like him spend years believing they are untouchable. When accountability finally hits, it comes all at once. Daniel continued. Several board members had already requested independent reviews. I nodded. "Good." "There is more," he added. I waited. "Some of Richard's longtime business partners are distancing themselves." That surprised me less than it should have. Loyalty is easy when success is guaranteed. It is much harder when risk appears. "What about the ownership records?" "They have been verified." I closed my eyes. For years, those records remained hidden. Now they were finally being recognized and validated. It felt strange. Not because I cared about the money, but because it meant Thomas had been telling the truth the entire time. His warnings, his deep concerns, his fears, none of them had been imagined. He had seen the danger long before anyone else. And now, the world was finally catching up. Later that afternoon, Victor Reynolds stopped by. We sat on my back porch drinking coffee. The autumn air had turned cold. Leaves drifted across the yard. Neither of us spoke. Eventually, Victor broke the silence. "You know what is ironic?" I smiled faintly. "What?" "Richard spent years trying to look powerful." I laughed softly. "Oh, that is true." Victor shook his head. "The truly powerful never need to prove it." His words stayed with me because he was entirely right. Richard's entire identity had been built around appearances, status, influence, and recognition. Thomas was the exact opposite. He never cared if people knew what he accomplished, only that his work truly mattered. The vast difference between those two men had shaped everything. Victor eventually left, but first, he shared one final update. "Several people are preparing to cooperate." I frowned. Cooperate? Former employees, former executives, people who stayed silent for years. That got my attention. "Why now?" Victor smiled sadly. "Because fear only lasts as long as power." That statement proved accurate. Over the following weeks, more information emerged, more records, more witnesses, more questions. Every single revelation made Richard's position weaker, and every truth seemed to confirm what Thomas had suspected years ago. Then something happened that I never expected. Margaret Whitmore actually called me. At first, I thought about ignoring the call, but my curiosity won. When I answered, she sounded different. smaller, less confident. "Brenda," she said. I remained cautious. "Margaret." Then she spoke quietly. "I am sorry." Those words caught me completely off guard. For several seconds, I was unsure how to respond. Margaret continued. "I should have treated you better." I stared out the kitchen window, remembering the subtle insults, the fake smiles, and the dismissive comments. Part of me wanted to be angry, but instead, I just felt tired. "I appreciate that," I said. Her voice trembled. "I did not know everything." I believed her, at least partly. Margaret might have ignored certain truths, but I genuinely doubted she understood the full picture. Very few people did. Before hanging up, she said something completely unexpected. "Richard is not handling this well." I almost laughed. Talk about an understatement. What does that mean? Another pause. Then she answered, "He is scared." For years, I had imagined Richard as fearless, confident, and completely untouchable. The thought of him being frightened felt strange, yet somehow satisfying. Not because I enjoyed his suffering, but because fear meant accountability. A week later, the most shocking development arrived. Ethan lost his position, not completely and not permanently, but the massive promotion Richard had promised him completely vanished. The board postponed everything, pending reviews, pending investigations, pending clarity. Everything became pending. The future Ethan thought was guaranteed was suddenly gone. I learned all this through Olivia. She showed up at my house one afternoon without warning. The moment I opened the door, I knew. Her eyes were red, and she looked completely heartbroken. "Can I come in?" "Of course." We sat together in the living room. For a while, she just stared at the floor before finally speaking. "I do not know who my father is anymore." The pain in her voice was absolutely devastating. Unlike Ethan, Olivia had never intentionally chosen greed. She had simply trusted the wrong person. Her own father. I reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. "I am sorry." Tears welled in her eyes. "He lied to everyone." I stayed silent. There was nothing to say. Some truths cut too deep for easy comfort. Eventually, she asked, "Do you hate him?" I knew exactly who she meant. Richard. I took a moment to think. "No," she looked surprised. "Hating someone just gives them too much power," I added. The room fell silent. "I don't hate your father." "Then what do you feel?" I paused, searching for the honest truth. Disappointed. I just feel disappointed. Disappointed in Richard, in Ethan, in myself, in everything. Olivia quietly wiped away a tear. Then she nodded slowly, as if finally understanding. After she left, I sat thinking about the strange turns life takes. Months ago, the Whitmores treated me like an outsider in their world. Now that world was crumbling, and they were all desperately searching for answers, for stability, and for the truth. Meanwhile, Richard Whitmore's empire kept shrinking. Board seats vanished, and his influence dissolved. His partnerships collapsed. The consequences kept coming, falling one after another like dominoes. Yet I felt no desire for revenge. That surprised even me. I had every reason to be angry, to celebrate his absolute ruin, but I couldn't. Revenge would never give me what I actually wanted. It wouldn't restore lost years or erase painful memories. It would never bring Thomas back, or return the son I once knew. I did not want revenge. I wanted honesty, and now truth was finally winning. But the most important battle was still ahead. Because Richard Whitmore did not break my heart, Ethan did. And sooner or later, my son would have to choose what kind of man he wanted to be. A man shaped by power, or a man defined by character. The collapse of Richard's empire had begun, but my son's real test was only just starting. The first time Ethan came to apologize, I was out. I found a note slipped under my door after getting groceries. It was simple, just a single sentence. "Mom, please let me explain." No signature, no long excuses, no dramatic speeches, just those words. I stood in my kitchen for minutes, staring at it. Part of me wanted to call him right then. Part of me wanted to throw it in the trash. Neither felt right. So I slipped it into a drawer and went about my day. 2 days later, he showed up in person. I opened the door this time and found him standing out on the porch, completely alone. No Olivia, no Richard, no expensive suit or polished corporate image. Just Ethan, my son. For the first time in months, he looked vulnerable. Strangely young, like the little boy who used to wait by the window when I worked late. "Can we talk?" he asked softly. He had asked before, but this time, everything felt different. I stepped aside. "Come in." He walked inside, slow and nervous. The silence between us hung heavy. Neither of us knew how to start. Eventually, we sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I helped him with homework, the same table where we celebrated birthdays, the one where he recently begged me to sign away my rights. That memory still cut deep, but I pushed it aside for now. Ethan looked around. His eyes settled on the old photographs hanging near the hallway. Pictures of family trips, school events, Christmas mornings, remnants of a different, better life. Finally, he spoke. "I have been an idiot." That blunt honesty surprised me. I stayed quiet, letting him go on. He talked for a long time. I remained silent, not to punish him, but because he needed to keep speaking. This was not about what I had to say. It was about what he needed to understand. Ethan stared down at his hands. "I thought I was building something," he said, voice cracking. "A future." I listened quietly. I convinced myself I was doing the right thing. A painful smile crossed his face. The funny part is, I actually believed it. His words sounded completely genuine. No strategy, no rehearsals. For once, I saw genuine remorse instead of defensiveness, and that meant everything. Ethan sighed. When Richard started mentoring me, it felt incredible. He shook his head. I had never had someone like that. The words stung, not out of malice, but because they were true. Thomas died when Ethan was just a boy. Despite my best efforts, there were things I simply couldn't provide. A certain guidance, specific experiences, different perspectives. Richard had stepped right into that empty gap and slowly filled it, not as a father, but as a powerful influence. Ethan continued, "He made me feel important." I nodded. "I know." He talked about success constantly. Ethan paused, his voice turning bitter. He talked about winning. He let out a soft, sad laugh. The problem is, eventually I started believing that winning was all that mattered. Silence settled over the room. Outside, Rain tapped gently against the window. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan looked me dead in the eye and finally asked the question he had been dodging. "How long have I been hurting you?" The words nearly broke my heart. They just came too late. Far too late. But at least they finally came. I sat with the question for a moment, then answered honestly. "Longer than you realize." His eyes welled up, not with dramatic, showy tears, but real ones, the kind you try so hard to hide but cannot. "I am sorry." I actually believed him, and that was the hardest part. The man sitting across from me now was not the one who had brought Richard's paperwork into my kitchen. Something had changed. The ruin of Richard's empire forced my son to finally see himself clearly, and sometimes truth hurts more than punishment. We ended up talking for nearly an hour. Truly talked. For the first time in years. No screens, no excuses, no interruptions. Just pure honesty between us. He confessed how much he had loved the status, the spotlight, the doors it opened, and feeling like he belonged. Then he admitted something even tougher. Sometimes I was embarrassed. The confession just hung in the cold air, painful, uncomfortable, but necessary. I kept silent. Ethan looked away. I hate saying it, but it is true. He swallowed hard when Richard mocked where we came from. His voice trailed off. "I should have stood up for you." I nodded. "Yes." He closed his eyes. "I know." Quiet returned. Then I asked the question I had carried for months. "When Richard made you choose a side," he knew exactly what I meant. The study, the paperwork, the bargain. He bowed his head. "I chose wrong. It was simple, direct, and honest." Hearing it hurt less because he did not try to justify it. No excuses, no trying to twist the past, just the truth, and truth matters. Finally, he looked up. "Do you know what the worst part is?" I waited. He let out a bitter laugh. I actually thought I was choosing strength. His sadness was overwhelming, but I was really choosing weakness. I did not say a word. He was finally learning the hard lesson I could never force him to grasp. A lesson about character, about real integrity, and about who we are when nobody is looking. Our talk stretched late into the afternoon. Eventually, he asked the one question I had been bracing myself for. "Can you forgive me?" The question hung heavily between us, massive and complicated. I looked at my son closely. I really looked at him. There was no simple answer. Forgiveness and trust are entirely different things. A lot of people confuse them, but I do not. Finally, I answered. "I forgave you a long time ago." His eyes went wide. "What?" I gave him a sad smile. "The day you chose Richard." He looked completely confused. "Holding on to that anger would have ruined me," I explained. Silence fell over us again. "I forgave you because I needed peace." Tears ran down his face. "But?" The single word carried so much weight. I nodded. "Yes, but you deserve the honest truth. I forgive you." I paused. "But we cannot just go back to how things used to be." I saw the pain flash across his face, and I hated causing it. But false hope is worse. Trust takes years to build, seconds to break, and a lifetime to mend. And a whole lot of time My son slowly nodded as if he already knew. Part of him had expected that exact response. Then came one final question about the inheritance. And there it was, the one topic everyone had been secretly wondering about. The ownership, the money, the future. I looked him in the eyes. What about it? He hesitated, then shook his head. Never mind. His silence surprised me. For the first time, my son was not asking what he would receive. He was not asking what belonged to him or talking about money at all. Instead, he stood up and walked toward the door. He paused. Mom. His voice was barely a whisper. I know I do not deserve another chance. The pain in his voice sounded genuine. But I hope I can earn one. Then he walked out. I stood in the doorway long after he drove away, just staring at the empty street, remembering, thinking, and hoping. For the first time in a very long time, I caught a glimpse of the boy I had raised. He is not fully back yet, but he is there. And sometimes, healing starts right there, not with perfect, instant reconciliation, but with simple honesty. For months, my son had chosen money over his family, status over loyalty, ambition over character. Now, he finally understood the real cost, and that realization would change everything going forward. A month after talking with Ethan, I was sitting in Daniel Coleman's office again. But this visit felt entirely different from the others. The investigations were mostly done. All the ownership disputes were resolved, and the legal battles were finally winding down. For the first time in forever, we were not talking about the past. We were talking about the future. Daniel sat across from me, reviewing the final paperwork. Once he finished reading, he took off his glasses and smiled. Are you absolutely certain? I looked down at the papers on his desk. Then I smiled. More certain than I have been about anything in years. Daniel simply nodded. I figured you would say that. Most of my life, I saw money as a tool, not a goal, and definitely not who I was. Just a tool. Sure, it was useful and necessary, but never the most important thing. And that belief only grew stronger over this past year. After everything with Richard and Ethan, I finally saw the truth more clearly than I ever had before. Money only reveals your character. It does not build it. The rich can be greedy or kind, just like the poor. Cash is not the real issue here. It is the heart behind it. That truth guided every single choice I was about to make. Daniel slid another document across the desk. Last chance to change your mind, he said. I just laughed softly. I am not changing my mind, I told him. The papers laid out a new charity foundation, something I had spent weeks pouring my heart into planning. Over the years, I had met so many women with stories just like mine. They were widows, struggling single mothers, and elderly women cast aside by their own families after spending decades sacrificing everything. Some were drowning financially. Others were broken emotionally. And most fought both battles. I wanted to help them, not to be a hero, but because I truly knew their pain. That very afternoon, the Brenda Matthews Foundation officially became a reality. Our goal was simple: to lift up older women facing neglect, poverty, and isolation. We would provide emergency funds, housing, legal help, local community programs, and above all else, real dignity. I knew we could not solve every problem, but we could help, and that mattered. Once the paperwork was finished, Daniel smiled at me. Thomas would be proud, he said. Hearing that almost brought me to tears, because despite all the chaos, Thomas remained at the very center of my story. It was about his integrity, values, and vision. This foundation felt like a continuation of everything he believed in, not some cheap act of revenge, but a true act of purpose. A few weeks later, we hosted a quiet launch event. Nothing flashy, just local leaders, volunteers, and people who genuinely supported our cause. They were the kind of people Richard Whitmore would never invite to his elite galas. Yet, I valued their company so much more. These folks actually cared, and that meant everything. As everyone arrived, I spotted a familiar face near the door. It was Ethan. Honestly, I was not sure if he would show up, but then our eyes met across the room. He gave me a nervous smile, instantly reminding me of the shy little boy who used to hide behind my legs. I smiled back. "I am glad you came," I said. "I would not have missed it," he replied, and his sincere tone touched me deeply. Over the last month, Ethan had really begun to change. It was not sudden or dramatic. Real personal growth rarely works that way anyway. Instead, it came through small, daily, deliberate choices. He had started volunteering and helping local groups in the community. He was even mentoring local teens and supporting programs for struggling families. He did not do it out of obligation, but because he actually wanted to. For once, I saw him chasing purpose rather than status, and that gave me real hope. A bit later, Olivia arrived and hugged me tightly. We were doing so much better. The sudden collapse of Richard's perfect reputation had forced some painful conversations within their family. They were brutal talks, but necessary. Over time, Olivia distanced herself from a lot of her father's toxic influence. She was still his daughter, of course, but she stopped accepting his word without question. Her growth honestly amazed me. It takes real courage to challenge the people you love. Olivia had that courage. At the event, speakers shared stories of resilience, community, and second chances. I listened in silence, feeling deeply grateful, not for the wealth, the legal wins, or the company shares, but for true perspective. It is the painful wisdom that only suffering can bring. Later, Ethan approached me by our mission display. For a moment, we just looked at it together. Then he quietly said, "I have been thinking about Dad." That caught me off guard. "Yes," he nodded. "A lot." I smiled gently. He would love that. After a quiet beat, Ethan laughed softly. "You know what is funny?" he asked. "What?" I replied. "For years, I thought success meant being some important person." He shook his head. "I never realized Dad already was." Those words hit me like a ton of bricks, because they were so true. Thomas never made magazine covers. He never chased fame or hunted for status. Yet his powerful impact remained decades later. That is what real success looks like. It is not about bank accounts, but legacy, character, love, and what lasts. A moment later, Ethan asked me a question. I knew he would ask about his inheritance eventually. Looking at him closely, I noticed his tone sounded different. There was zero greed or entitlement, just genuine curiosity. "What about it?" I asked. He shrugged. "I know you have been changing things." I smiled. Yes, that was true. After everything, Daniel and I had overhauled my estate plans completely. the foundation would get almost all my assets. Making that decision never felt hard, not even for a second, because I finally knew exactly what I wanted my legacy to be. Helping people, not just collecting things. Ethan nodded slowly, then completely surprised me. I think that is the right call. For a few seconds, I just stared. He smiled, a truly genuine smile. The old version of me would have been disappointed. I laughed softly. The old version? He nodded. I do not like that version very much anymore. Neither did I. But hearing him say it meant more than he knew. Real growth only begins when we stop defending our worst mistakes and start learning from them. I put a hand on his shoulder. I am proud of you. His eyes widened. The words clearly caught him off guard. Maybe because he felt he did not deserve to hear them, or maybe because he had not heard them in a while. Either way, real emotion flooded his face. Thanks, Mom. It felt simple, small, and quiet, yet it meant everything. Healing rarely comes from grand gestures. It happens in moments just like this. Moments where we choose honesty, choose humility, choose love. As the evening wound down and guests started leaving, I stood alone for a few minutes, watching and reflecting. My foundation was launched. The future felt brighter. The wounds were not completely healed. Maybe some never would be, but they were healing, and that was enough. Before leaving, I glanced at a framed photograph near the entrance. A photograph of Thomas. Underneath it sat a simple quote, one of his favorites. Character is what remains when everything else is taken away. I smiled. After everything we had been through, I finally understood exactly what those words meant. Soon, I would make sure that understanding shaped the legacy I leave behind. It has been almost 3 years since my son chose his wealthy father-in-law over me. 3 years since Daniel Coleman walked into that crowded ballroom. 3 years since Richard Whitmore's carefully built world began to crumble. Sometimes people ask if I would do things differently if given another chance. My answer is always no. Not because the pain was easy, it was not. And not because I enjoyed watching family relationships break, I did not. And definitely not because I liked seeing Ethan suffer. My mother's heart does not work that way. The reason I would not change a thing is simple. The truth finally gave us what we needed, a chance to become better people. Even me. Today, my life looks completely different than it did before all of this started. Not because of the money, the legal wins, or ownership stakes. It is because of peace. For the first time in decades. I wake up every morning without carrying any bitterness or heavy resentment. No more carrying the burden of pretending everything is fine when it is not. That freedom is worth more than any inheritance. My Brenda Matthews Foundation has grown far beyond my wildest dreams. What started as a local project now serves women across many different communities. Every month, I meet women whose stories remind me why I do this. Widows abandoned by family. Grandmothers raising grandkids all alone. Women who spent decades sacrificing everything for others, only to be cast aside when they became inconvenient. Whenever I sit with them, I recognize a familiar feeling, pain, loneliness, and disappointment. But I also see something else, real strength, the kind of strength people rarely notice, the kind of strength that quietly survives impossible hardships, the strength I once had to find in my own reflection. Helping these brave women has helped me heal in so many ways. They saved me just as much as I helped them. As for Richard Whitmore, his world fell apart. His massive influence vanished. His businesses were restructured. Longtime associates quickly moved on. The heavy reputation he spent decades building never recovered. I rarely think about him these days, not because I forgot, but because he no longer holds any space in my heart. Some people think healing means winning, defeating your enemy and watching them fail. I have learned something different. True healing begins when another person's actions stop controlling your peace. Richard no longer controls mine, and that feels like pure freedom. Margaret eventually moved into a smaller place near her sister. We talk occasionally, not often, but enough. I hear sadness in her voice and regret, but I also hear relief. Sometimes breaking an illusion finally makes room for honesty. I believe that is what happened to her. Olivia stayed closely involved with my foundation. That surprised a lot of people, but not me. She has a quiet kindness that survived everything her family destroyed. Over the years, we built a connection that feels far more real than anything we ever shared before. Not based on high society expectations or keeping up appearances, just true mutual respect. Then there is Ethan, the one people always ask about first, the one whose choices started this whole journey. Honestly, rebuilding our bond took much longer than either of us ever expected. Trust is like a home. You can spend decades building it, but a single storm can tear it down. Repairing it takes time, so much time. For months after we reconciled, Ethan kept showing up, not with grand speeches or empty promises, but with real, consistent actions. He volunteered, mentored young people, helped with community programs, and supported our projects. Sometimes he spent entire weekends painting community centers or out delivering supplies. No one asked him. No one rewarded him. He just did. At first, I wondered if guilt drove him. Maybe it did. But over time, things shifted. The work stopped being about redemption. It became who he was. One afternoon last spring, we were driving back from a foundation event. The talk drifted toward childhood memories. We laughed over old stories and memories, the kind of easy conversation we had not shared in years. Then Ethan suddenly said something that stayed with me. I spent so much time trying to be successful that I forgot who taught me what success actually means. I looked at him and he smiled. A real, genuine smile I had not seen since he was young. In that moment, I realized something important. The son I thought I had lost forever was not gone. He had simply lost his way. Now he was finding his way back, not to the past, because the past can never be recreated. Instead, towards something wiser, better, and more honest. Recently, Daniel invited Ethan and me to lunch. The three of us sat together, discussing foundation projects and future plans. At one point, Daniel excused himself. As soon as he left, Ethan looked at me and laughed. "What?" I asked. He just shook his head. "I was just thinking." "About what?" "How different everything could have been." The words hung in the air. I understood exactly what he meant. A different choice, a different path. Perhaps none of the pain would have happened, or perhaps something even worse would have happened. We will never know. Life does not let us compare alternate endings. We only get one story, Kim, one path, one chance to learn. Eventually, Ethan reached across the table and squeezed my hand. A simple gesture that meant everything. Because years earlier, he had chosen wealth over family, status over loyalty, and approval over truth. Now he understood what those choices cost. More importantly, he knew what truly matters. A few weeks ago, I updated my estate documents one last time. The foundation remains the primary beneficiary. That decision has not changed. Neither has the condition attached to Ethan's portion. Daniel laughed when he reviewed it. You know, most people would just leave money. I smiled. Money is not the lesson. The condition is simple. If Ethan wishes to receive his portion someday, he must continue serving others. Not for a month, not for a year, for the rest of his life. Because the greatest inheritance Thomas ever left was not ownership. It was not wealth or business interests. It was character, and character only survives when we practice it. Sometimes I sit on my back porch in the evening and think about everything that happened. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the courtroom meetings, the revelations, the apologies, the healing, all of it. Then I look at the sunset, look at the sky, and remember what Thomas always said. The truth takes longer, but it travels farther. He was right. The truth took years to emerge, but when it finally arrived, it changed everything. Not because it made us richer, but because it made us honest. And in the end, that honesty gave me back what I thought I had lost forever. My peace, my dignity, and eventually, my son. Looking back on this journey, the greatest lesson is not about money, inheritance, or business ownership. It is about the choices we make when our values are tested. Many believe betrayal begins with one terrible decision. In reality, it often begins with small compromises. A moment of silence when we should speak. A choice to ignore what we know is wrong. A willingness to trade character for convenience. Ethan did not become a different person overnight. He slowly allowed ambition to replace gratitude. Like many of us, he convinced himself that success justified certain sacrifices. But eventually, he learned what all of us must learn. No amount of wealth can ever replace integrity. And no opportunity is worth losing the people who truly love you. I also learned that forgiveness is not weakness. Forgiveness doesn't mean pretending the pain never happened. It doesn't mean trusting someone immediately. It simply means refusing to let bitterness control your future. Most importantly, I learned that dignity matters. No matter how others treat you, never allow anyone to define your worth. Not by your income, not by your status, not by your age. Your value comes from who you are, not what you own. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to choose between family and success? Have you ever forgiven someone who deeply hurt you? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story may encourage someone else who needs hope today. And if you enjoyed this journey, please like, subscribe, and join our community. There are many more stories ahead, and I'd be honored to share them with you.